You got nothing left to lose tonight. In the end we'll see a change. Only love lasts, only love. The night we shall go in. Won't you follow me down, 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 down. It's the crime of the century. We fight for the reason honoring everyone we left behind. Till life is brought back to every kind. Give me everything you got. Let's leave this world behind.
Hello, everybody. Jacob Daniel here with the Daniel 3 podcast. How y'all doing? This is a pre-recorded live stream again, just because while I'm still finishing up my home studio, I'm doing it from work, and the internet here is like just good enough to get a guest on, but not really good enough to do a live stream without making it all choppy. So is what it is at the moment. I'll miss interacting with all of you guys live, because that's a lot of fun. I'm hoping, sometime, probably not until after Christmas, but sometime I'll probably get back into the swing of things once the studio is done with doing everything live, because I think it's more fun that way. But at the same time, there's utility to doing things like we are doing tonight. Tonight I have a guest who I'm going to bring up here pretty soon. Tonight's going to be a conversation about anarchism and like the divide between those who would classify themselves as left anarchists, which is kind of more of the classical anarchists. The original anarchists were on the left, and then the more like modern Rothbardian right anarchists. And there's a acquaintance of mine, kind of a friend. We've had many battles where we've been at each other, and then other battles where we've been on the same side. And so it's interesting. There's a lot of things we agree on and a lot of things we disagree on. And, the utility of not doing this live is that we can just focus on the conversation and not so much on the comments and what people are saying. So I'm going to bring him on now and let him introduce himself. His name is Zach Britt. Zach, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty good. Introduce myself, or
yeah, go ahead and just introduce yourself and your background, and maybe just, I always like to ask my guests to start out to just explain a little bit about how they came to have the beliefs that they have.
Sure. Okay. If you can't tell by my name on the screen, it is Zach Britt. I'm a third-year history major at Mississippi State University. I'm a regional coordinator with Students for Liberty, which is an international organization that facilitates discussions and groups on campuses all across the world for libertarian thought and classical liberalism as well. And I do a lot of other things on campus. Particularly, I'm on the executive committee for a group specifically on my campus for just about the abolition of prisons, or just like broad criminal justice reform. So I do a lot of that work as well. I'm also on Twitter at RealZachBritt. A lot of spicy takes, get people mad. It's fun. And yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like So I remember when we first sort of became acquaintances, which was you were trying to join the Mises Caucus group, and we also met like in the Figuritarians group on Facebook, and so we talked a little bit there back and forth privately, and then we got to talk a lot more when the Clubhouse app became more popular, and we found ourselves in a lot of rooms, and it was funny on Facebook. We seemed to be, and then Twitter later, we seemed to often be debating each other. But then when we were talking in a more personable fashion in various clubhouse rooms, we were often on the same side. And so that was a little bit of an interesting dichotomy, and sort of where I wanted to start out with, maybe to start with where we agree, I guess, because although we do have differences in maybe economic views, cultural views, etc., we are both anarchists at the end of the day. And so, there clearly is many things that we would hold in common. So I wanted to kind of start there, maybe get you to, regardless, like no left or right connotations, just describe what like your identity as an anarchist, like what it means to you, like how you would define it, and what your own take on these things are.
Sure. There were a lot of questions there, so I'll try to touch on most of them. We have had some great conversations on Clubhouse. Like you said, on the same side of a lot of debates and conversations and discussions, which is, I mean, even for a left or right, and like, both of us being different left and right anarchists, it's definitely easier on Clubhouse because it's just overrun by statists. And so, even if you have like a minor disagreement, even if it's an important disagreement, things that are important to discuss and hammer out, obviously you're going to be on the same side on a lot of issues. So yeah, 100%. And then that goes into the whole thing where on my Twitter bio, I have hashtag bottom unity, and I'm a big proponent of it. I think that left and right libertarians, anarchists should unite on the issues that we agree on, form coalitions, because I think as a unit, whether it be through direct action or whether it be through even voting, some anarchists might not like voting, but it can be used as a source of good. To achieve things that we want to get done in, whether it be in the government or in society or whatever. And then I would say, right now, my belief on anarchism is that anarchy, and even ANCAPs can, agree with this. Like, anarchism is the belief that all hierarchies that are unjust should be abolished. Now, you can, whether or not you think that, certain hierarchies are just is obviously subjective. ANCAPs believe that capitalism is a just hierarchy, so they want to keep it up there. But obviously, anarcho-communists, for example, which I am not, by the way, anarcho-communists would say that capitalism is a it's an unjust hierarchy, and so we must abolish it and have communism everywhere, right? So that's kind of generally where I come from. Is I seek to either limit or abolish most unjust hierarchies, I would say.
Cool. So, kind of also continuing to try to figure out, like, because, just to point out on the things we agree on, I feel like a lot of things pertaining to the nature of the state and some of like the really big issues, I feel like, there's not going to be really any disagreement. Like, so, I mean, we can just run through the list. I mean, obviously, I would imagine that we're both against war,
Yeah,
especially
against war,
state,
100%.
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't classify myself as a pacifist, so I guess there's the maybe hypothetically a situation where perhaps, war on some scale might be justified, but to me, it's never justified through the state because of taxation and just, just kind of like the nationalism that's sort of inherent in the state. I think just makes, just the idea that there could be a just war is usually impossible. They always end up targeting innocent civilians and people who aren't, responsible for the crimes of the other nation. So, I would imagine war is where we, one of the major issues we agree on. Nationalism is probably another issue where we would probably agree on. I feel like nationalism, although I can sometimes maybe try to rescue a baby from the bathwater there, because I guess there's different types of nations or nationalism, but at least like the type of nationalism that is sort of like this kind of collectivism that like makes you very subject and dependent to the nation you belong, where it's like any crime of the nation is a crime that we hold the individuals of the nation responsible for, even if they had no say in it. Kind of like, it's like, oh, I guess an example would be like, let's say World War II, Germany was obviously like the German government and the Nazis were evil, but it would be wrong to hold every German accountable for the crimes of the Nazis. So I would imagine we agree also on just kind of like the nature of nationalism in general.
Could I
Or you
add
can,
something to that?
yeah, go ahead. If you, I
Yeah.
mean, feel free to if there's
Okay.
any little nuances there you feel like you need to pick out, go ahead.
Sure. So I don't know if you've taken a variety. I'm sure you have taken a variety of political compass quizzes, but there's this question on a particular one, and there's a variation of it. It's everything my country does is good, or I believe that my country is greater than others. And I find that I have a lot of disagreement with people who answer yes to either of those questions, because I think that no matter where you're born, like, or there's another question where it's I'm proud to be a member of my country, right? Which I mean, you can have that answer yes to that question and not be a nationalist, but I found that like people who think there's certain uniquely good things about the country they're born in, or that they should have some sort of loyalty to the country they're born in, whether it be the state or the nation, or the nation state, right? I found that I disagree with those people quite a bit, and that's where a lot of my little squabbles on Twitter come from. Is people who are they think somehow uniquely America is good at protecting liberty, or being just generally like respecting human rights, property rights, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, American exceptionalism and things like that. I'm very much not a fan of. And it's like, to me, it's like if there's anything good about a nation, it can be separated from the nation. Like if there's anything good about America, like the nation of America or the history of it, it should be the ideas that we can separate from the nation, or individual acts of people within that nation that we would say, well, it wasn't because they were American that they did those good things. Those are just good things. We evaluate them as good or bad on some other sort of epistemology that's not just like, it was good because it was American. So I think it's okay to have a certain pride in certain group identities you have, and sometimes that can be like if you're a member of like a First Nations tribe, or I don't know, some kind of culture that you describe as a nation. I guess that's, again, like there's a little baby in a bathwater thing kind of thing there, and I always try to not be, I don't know, like too quick to damn any form of nationalism, but I think it's in a general sense something that as an anarchist I push back pretty strongly on, and it sounds like you do too. So.
Sure. Yeah, and there are we can't forget that there are individuals, like to use your indigenous nations example. There are individuals within this within some of these First Nations. And who are we to say that they can't, have a common identity, right? They're individuals. They make these choices. So, yeah, I mean, sure. I think that collectivism is an evil that we need to, fight against. But at the end of the day, there are certain ways in which people can collectivize themselves, and all the individuals within those people, they identify with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. It's, just to quickly run through the rest of the areas of agreement, I'd imagine, again, a lot of this stuff is probably common sense, but I just feel like it's useful at the beginning before we get into a lot of the differences, just to highlight all the areas of agreement. I mean, because I feel like, although it's going to seem, I think a lot of times it can feel like left and right anarchists are like worlds apart, when in reality, it's like we're just two like extremes within a very small minority, in which like we're a lot closer to each other than we are the rest of the world. But it's just we hyper focus on our differences. But the war on drugs, the police state, that stuff, I think we're going to agree pretty much across the board. I can't imagine, like I'm pretty anti police. I believe that if there's any type of security that should be provided to people, or some kind of enforcement of contracts and stuff, that should be done by the market, not through so many kind of monopolistic, state provided force. And then, yeah, I mean, the war on drugs obviously being a huge tragedy of human human value in life. I mean, America has like the world's biggest prison population, pretty much because of the war on drugs, causes a lot of
Of all
issues.
time, of all time.
Yeah, so it's pretty bad there. And I guess like to get to more, it's like on the issues. I feel like the only issue, which we'll probably get into a bit later, but the only issue that I think right and left anarchists will often butt heads on are probably things more pertaining to economics and probably pertaining to borders, which we'll get into there. But other than that, I feel like the war on drugs, the police state, criminal justice reform, like these are things that left and right anarchists, we'll generally share the same end goals with. In a philosophical sense, I would imagine, we both view the state as an instrument of coercion. Like I would describe, as identifying as an anarchist. That now, I mean, I'm trying to keep my Christian spin off of this a little bit, because that would make the conversation 10 times longer and more complicated. But like just describing just the anarchist side of my beliefs, I don't believe that any man or woman has the right to be a master over somebody else. And that, it's kind of like, or another way to state it is, I believe in self-ownership, that we are autonomous sovereign individuals, and that the only interactions between these sovereign individuals should be voluntary, that there should not be some or I also like the language of like rights, where I believe we all have the same rights. It's wrong for there to be any person or group of people that have a right to do something that I don't have a right to do. And this doesn't solely exist through the state, but the state's kind of the most common and most current form or apparatus in which these things get violated. So I mean, is there anything there you disagree with? Like, I think there we would probably pretty much agree that that's sort of like the fundamental basis of anarchism is, believing in the sovereignty of I guess like individual rights. Or would you add any nuance to that?
I could add something. I think that having people in the movement or the party that agree with us on certain positions are, it's important. But I also think that the reason why people come to these positions is also important, right? Because you can kind of like a broken clock strikes twice, or sometimes broken clock can get things right. The saying, right? Broken clock. Sometimes people can have certain like good positions on like say taxes, right? But it's for the wrong reasons. They come at it from like a status position, right? Like a conservative that has libertarian positions on some things, or like a social democrat that would have certain positions we would agree with on, like drug laws or criminal justice reform, right? So these people might agree with us on certain positions, but if they have the wrong reason for getting that to that point, then that's where we should have the discussion. Maybe welcome them to the party, even just like say, hey, this is why we come to our conclusions. These are our principles, right? You may have different principles or like a different way to come to these things, but at the end of the day, as long as you agree with us on certain things, then you can come fight with us.
Cool. So I think we've covered the areas of agreement pretty well. I guess one of the topics I wanted to start with, as far as like where I feel like you and I, and then left and right anarchism will diverge a little bit, is sort of like, you kind of started out with this, your definition, and you modified it slightly from how you've used it in the past, at least on Twitter. And I won't hold that against you, because Twitter gives you character limits, so we are always having to modify the things we say on Twitter. But you said it's was it the abolition or the opposition against all unjust hierarchies?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So, it seems sometimes, from my perspective, that it almost seems like left anarchists are generally almost always against hierarchies, or they view hierarchies as always inherently unjust, or at least they view them very suspiciously. So maybe we can dive a little bit more into that.
Yeah. So I use the definition on Twitter that left anarchists, or even just anarchists in general, are in favor of the abolition or the strict limitation of all hierarchies. Which I had one of my friends who was an ANCAP, and we had a discussion about the nuances of capitalism, but they told me the definition from their perspective, which is an ANCAP perspective, was the abolition of all unjust hierarchies, and that makes more sense to me too, because like I've seen on Twitter, there are some hierarchies that may be that people may perceive as hierarchies, but that are actually just like natural, and there's really not much you can do about it. So it's not about like we have to abolish all hierarchies no matter what. There are some hierarchies that can't be abolished because of nature. However, even some of those that may be natural, they can be mitigated. So it just depends on which of these hierarchies you think is valid or just or even natural, essentially.
Sure. Yeah, I remember that conversation because that's what I was alluding to earlier. I was like, you kind of amended it since I guess that interaction, because I would agree with that in a sense that like if a hierarchy is unjust, well, I mean, like it's sort of like almost necessarily something you have to reject, because if it's unjust, that means like you know what I mean, like how could you support something that's unjust? It's kind of like definitionally like I support things that are unjust. It's like no one would do that. And I guess it's kind of like the devil might be in the details about like how we would define what makes a hierarchy just or unjust, which is maybe where we need to dive in a little bit. To me, if so let's pretend we have perfect anarchy. We've removed the state from the equation. We have a society that's completely a spontaneous order of people just interacting with each other. To me, if any hierarchy is formed, whether it's through nature or through the marketplace, some kind of business or some kind of organization, or some kind of societal order, if it's happened without coercion, like no one has, I guess, like violated the NAP, no one has initiated aggression or coercion against another group of people, I would have to say that hierarchy is just. Where I don't know if this is something you would agree with, but I feel like some left anarchists and just left-leaning people in general would say a hierarchy is unjust if it produces an inequality. So which way would you lean there? Is it just that we need the absence of coercion, or would you say that if a hierarchy produces an inequality of a certain degree beyond what is desirable or something, that it's something we should oppose?
I mean, it's definitely a tough question and one that I haven't really thought about very much. I would say there are some unjust hierarchies. Wait, I'm just having difficulty framing this. So maybe a little bit of both, I would say.
A little bit of both. So I mean, if there's ever a point where there's coercion that's implemented, we're both going to pretty much like across the board be against that. So there's no debate there that if someone gets ahead, gains some kind of power or status or advantage, and it's not through voluntary transaction, it's through some sort of aggression, that's going to be something that we would both be against. The inequality thing is where we're going to start to probably see more diverging thoughts, because to me inequality is inevitable. And while I wouldn't say that inequality is I wouldn't say inequality is desirable in the sense that like it's not my goal. Like it's not my goal to produce inequality, but if you try to make your goal to eliminate inequality, I feel like there's a little bit of a danger there, because I think you hit a wall where if you've removed all, like if there's definitely in our current like market we have today, inequalities that are caused by different levels of coercion, like corporate welfare, bailouts, things like that, where intellectual property laws, copyright. There's things where people have gained what I would say is an unfair advantage in the marketplace and have exploited that for wealth and power. And I'm against that. And I'd imagine you would be too. Um, but absent that, if an inequality exists, I don't know if there's a way to oppose it without instituting some sort of coercion. And that's where it gets a little bit slippery. Like when some left anarchists say that they're against inequality, it's like, okay, well, there's always going to be varying levels of competency, right? And some people will be more successful than others. What do we do to combat inequality? And what level of inequality? Like, do we need perfect equality, or is it like, is there a certain amount of inequality that's tolerable, but when it hits a certain point, it's no longer tolerable? I guess that's where like my questions would be aimed at.
Sure, and I can answer that with a very relevant example. So there's an essay by Charles Johnson. He works for the Center for a Stateless Society, and he talks about like a market freed from capitalism. And his definition of capitalism and yours might be very different. But basically, the idea is that if we eliminate the state tomorrow, right, we're not going to have a perfectly free market with like property rights being respected, right? There's still going to be the aftermath, the effects of privileges or monopolies granted by the state that still exist in the market. Corporations are still going to exist that have been built up off of taxpayer money, been built up off of unjust land titles, even sometimes, taken from people, whether it be through eminent domain or whatever. So yeah, opposing, I wouldn't consider myself to be a state reductionist, because I don't think that we should strive to eliminate the state at every single turn, no matter what. Because at the end of the day, like if I had a button right now that said eliminate the state, right, and that was nothing else changed except for the elimination of the state, my ideal society wouldn't exist, and I doubt yours would either. I mean, would you press that button and your perfect society would exist just because the state doesn't exist anymore, or would something else have to be done before that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a bit of a tricky question. I mean, I'm really tempted. There's a button that says that the state ceases to exist. I'm tempted to press it, but I feel like the inevitable conclusion of that is that if the culture hasn't changed, they'll just create another state. I would certainly be like interested to see that experiment, though. Like, I would say I'm a little agnostic. Like, I'd like to, but I'm not convinced that it would lead to the society I want. It's possible, but it could probably go either way.
Well, it's like the stereotypical, I know probably most ANCAPs don't believe this, but the stereotypical, ANCAPistan where the state ceases to exist and these large corporate overlords decide to like buy entire like land, like giant lands, like states, like entire like, states of land, just buying it outright and then owning that land and taxing people that want to live there in the form of like rent, just very authoritarian, like even like small scale like monarchies.
I've heard that concern, but I guess
Yeah.
it's just to me it's unfounded, because if you've again, this is all kind of hypothetical, so it's a little it can be a little silly, but if there's no state, there's no way to buy land except to buy land from people who already own the land. But the vast majority of land that's owned is land that's not developed or homesteaded at all. And so I think that the idea that like corporations and an ANCAP society would just buy up all the land, it's like, well, buy from whom? Like right now they buy it from the state, you know what I mean? Because the state kind of holds this artificial monopoly over the land. So they're able to use their vast resources to the state to be like, hey, we're going to be the owners of all of this. Like we haven't done anything to it. We've just given money to the state to say we own this unoccupied, unhomesteaded land, and that we get to either sell it to somebody else or, sell or we'll rent it to people, lease it to people and stuff. But I feel like that would not be very feasible in an ANCAP society, because there's no one to go and, you can't go to the middle of Colorado and an unabandoned field and like, I'm going to buy this land. It's like, cool, but nobody owns it. So like your choices are to homestead it and make something that people want to buy, or like you can say it's yours, but like there's no power to enforce that. Uh,
So your prerequisite to owning land would be to homestead it.
I mean, generally, land ownership's a bit of a that could be almost a whole podcast. I mean, I've looked into the various different thoughts. I've looked into like the Georgist critique of land ownership very extensively. Like I read Henry George's progress versus progress versus the property versus progress. It's like it's PvP. I forget the exact words that go in there, but I've read from that and talked to Georgists on their critiques of that, and it's definitely it's a part of ANCAP literature that's a little underdeveloped. If there was going to be a place that like it's like, how would land ownership exactly play out? Like the answer is usually, well, it's through voluntary transactions in the marketplace. It's okay, but like, what does that look like? And it's a little bit of it kind of varies, because the way that it's going to work in a city or urban environment is going to differ from how it's going to work in a more rural environment. So, but in general, homesteading is probably at least the first basis for a legitimate claim to land ownership, I would say.
Yeah, and generally speaking, I agree with that. I'm not too well versed or well read on the subject of like property norms, but a lot of my disagreement with a large majority of like right anarchists or ANCAPs would be a lot of them, or some of them, typically ignore the real reality that a lot of property claims right now are only existing because of the state granting it, or the state having a monopoly over property. And even Rothbard talks about this in great length. There's the one essay, Confiscation, the Homestead Principle.
Yes.
He even brought up in other essays as well, like, really, some would even call it like left libertarian arguments for property norms, but like Rothbard saying it like back, in the 80s, right? Like,
I think the only, so communists don't really have private property norms. Mutualists kind of do, but the mutualists lose me when it comes to absentee property ownership, because I do believe that if you've homesteaded something that has a particular purpose where you're not going to always be in your property, I don't think that means you forfeited your right to your property. I just think that, there's various ways that would be enforced and negotiated with your neighbors and things like that. I certainly understand the critiques about our current system and rent seeking and things like that, but I think those are more a result of the state than they are of capitalism or private property, rights in a vacuum. I think, unfortunately, I think this is true of just people in general, but there's a lot of people who call themselves ANCAPs, but really have not dived deep into the literature. It's just like they go, oh, well, taxation is theft. I'm an ANCAP. It's like, yeah, there's a bit more to anarchism and anarcho-capitalism than just taxation is theft. It's not like anarchist society is just everything that's true about our society minus taxes. That's a bit of a gross oversimplification.
Right, and this might be a little bit off topic, but even looking at Rothbard's like classic Rothbard, his originally he invented the word anarcho-capitalism, right? It has its roots in this individual anarchism, like from the 1800s, right? Proudhon, Benjamin Tucker. It has its roots in that foundation, right? Like classical libertarianism, the original anarchism, right? Not all classical libertarianism or anarchism as it is traditionally used, not all of it is collectivist. Not all of it is the social anarchists you think of when you think of like anarcho-communists, right? So his work definitely has value, I think, even in left libertarian spaces. And I do think that his use of the word capitalism is definitely interesting. I think Because I agree with him on a lot of things, whether whenever it comes to the property norms and markets, but I don't think that what he advocates for is like capitalism. I just think it's free markets, and I think you probably think that free markets and capitalism are synonymous, right? But when
Sort
we're
of, but I
talking,
also don't feel the need to die on that hill.
sure,
Like
yeah,
I'm not so tied to the word capitalism that I feel a need to to a fault argue for the term. The principle matters more to me, which is just like, I mean, I definitely am a big proponent of private property rights. So I believe in voluntary trade, I believe in self-ownership, and I believe you own the products of your labor, and no one has a right to your body or your property. So I mean, it's like if we can agree on that, then it's like, okay, well, the devil is in the details a little bit, maybe, but I really don't. You call it zebranomics or whatever. Like the name's a little bit of like very little consequence if the principles are there. I like the term ANCAP or capitalism just because it's a nice short. It's a nice term to help distinguish at least that I'm an anarchist, but I'm not a socialist, because I definitely don't believe in the labor theory of value or in the idea of uh, I don't believe in an anarchy devoid of private property rights, I guess. So if there was a better way to language is a bit of a like words are tools, so I want to use the best tools. Someone gives me a better word than anarcho-capitalist, I would consider it, but I've yet to come across it because it's just the best. Like it's the best way in very short in a short time span to uh provide a shorthand for what my beliefs are, I guess. So
sure, yeah. I don't mean to be a shill, but I have this book, Markets Not Capitalism.
yes,
Even
I've
if you are
read that.
even if you are right libertarian, you should read it. It's a good book. And I kind of laughed a little bit because there's one of the essays goes into like, it's a very nuanced essay. It's about Rothbard particularly and his idea of capitalism, and there were some people arguing that Rothbard should be included with the individualist anarchists, and therefore would be included under the umbrella of socialist, which is a very broad term, right? But not thinking of like state socialists, right? But he wouldn't be considered a capitalist by these people who are left market anarchists. So
Yeah, like to me, like
very
capitalism
nuanced
just
stuff.
to me, like capitalism means the private ownership of the means of production. And if you define it any other way, I just feel like you're muddying the term, because it's like if it's anything beyond that, well then it's not capitalism. And the same thing happens to socialism. Like people tend to use the word socialism in ways that I'm like, well, socialism to me just means the opposite of capitalism. It's the collective ownership of the means of production. So I'm definitely against that. So, and but then it's confusing because some left anarchists and mutualists describe themselves as left socialists, and I don't quite get it. And I've tried to study mutualism a bit, but it just seems to me like it's a lukewarm in between, I guess. And that's why I have an aversion to it. It's like they don't quite agree with socialism, but they don't quite agree with private, like just full Austrian private property anarchism. And so they're kind of in this weird muddied middle where I don't know. It's like because sometimes it could depend. It depends who you talk to. I've had some mutualists describe their economic framework to me where I go, well, that's just everything I believe, basically. But I've had others describe their economic framework and I go, well, that just sounds like socialism with extra steps. So, what are
One
your?
of,
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, one of my friends, you might know him as Black Mutualist, but I know him as by his real name. But one thing he said to me once was that ANCAPs are about like two steps away from mutualism, and so that's why he tries to align himself with ANCAPs and like the LP in general, because he believes that ANCAPs are actually closer to his ideology than say other mutualists would like to say. um yeah, I forgot what I was going to say after that, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess it's like we should probably dive a little bit into the economic differences, which ties back into the original topic of hierarchy. But it's just, it's like, is there anything about private property rights that you find yourself at odds with? Something you think that either it's missing or something that needs to be added to that to have a functioning economic system? Because I mean, to me, I'm happy this is why I classify myself as more of a right anarchist, at least, but economically is just that I feel like it all boils down to self ownership. Like to me, it's like anarchism necessitates self ownership, because if you don't own yourself, that means somebody else does, and that can't be anarchy, because that would violate the no masters part of no anarchy. So I mean, the no masters, yeah, the no masters part of anarchy. So self ownership necessitates property rights, I think, and I don't know how you can have trade or any kind of economy of scale without that. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure, I can go into that. I mentioned earlier, but I think that a lot of the private property land titles that we have right now are unjust in the way that it's just been, granted through state privileges and state monopolies. But I
Agreed.
also think that, and this book goes into it. One of the titles it's against bosses and inequality. So essentially, if a person wants to work in a wage labor scenario where they have a boss, and in my ideal society they would be more than willing to, but there would be better alternatives, right? So an alternative to like the wage labor traditional sense of a business would be, like a democratized business where you have like a worker co-op. But right now, because of, you know multiple different forces going against it, the state has certain tax codes that prohibits or limits the ability of these people to form their co-ops, or if they form them, they have to have these long complicated taxes, and it's just really hard to do that for workers trying to own a business. And also, like, banks, that they don't really like to give loans to worker co-ops because they're seen as like this this kind of like inefficient, or just because it's non-traditional, these banks just don't want to touch them, right? So in my ideal anarchist society, there would be an easier way to avoid wage labor. You could own like a business with your fellow workers. You could be able to, like, people have side hustles right now where they make like crafts and shit, right? That would be easier to do because you wouldn't have a state taxing all your income, multiple different things that come into that, right? But the idea is that the main source of income right now is wage labor. And the argument there is that in this wage labor scenario, you don't own the fruits of all of your labor, right? We're against taxes because the state is taking a fruit of our labor. Well, a person who it does not have your best interest in mind, is only looking for their best interests, is also taking from your fruits of labor as well, which in a voluntary scenario is acceptable, but it's not the preferred system of most workers. And a lot of people would like to avoid that. But right now, with the scenario that we have with, massive state power that protects corporate capitalism, it's almost impossible to do otherwise.
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not against worker co-ops. I think those are completely conceivable within a private property economic structure. I agree with you that there are certain barriers to entry or creating these things, although some of those barriers are just the generic barriers that exist to all entrepreneurship right now. It's just hard to be a small business in general. So some of that's unique, and maybe some of it's just the general barriers to entry and overregulation of the market that the state engages in through taxation and just regulatory capture and all that. The big businesses like to crowd out all competition, so that's definitely something we agree on, that's bad. I guess my intuition is that in a market setting, there's going to be different tools that are better for certain jobs. And I think there's probably certain industries or certain jobs or just things that the market will want that worker co-ops would probably most likely be better at. But then there are probably some other things where they might not be better at that a more traditional, employee employer kind of structure, and it just kind of depends. It's kind of what my gut feeling is. But it seems like you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's not because like some left anarchists would say that wage labor is slavery and theft, and it sounds like you're more saying, well, no, they're not theft, and it's not immoral, but it's not always preferable, and there's especially some things going on in the current kind of corporatist structure we have where like people aren't really given any other choice realistically, and so it's that lack of choice that makes it a bigger deal. Whereas like, and I would agree with you there. Like I think in an ANCAP society there'd be more entrepreneurs and more people who they'd have a lot more options, and not only that, but like they wouldn't be dealing with this constant rising inflation and destruction of the value of the fiat currency that they're forced to deal with. And just so that inherently also would mean they wouldn't have to work as many hours, and their labor would be worth more than it is currently worth. So I think I share those criticisms to a certain degree, as long as they're saying, hey, like what's going on right now isn't preferable, and that in a true free market setting, there would be a wider diversity that would be better. And that even, you could probably agree, in a free market where certain businesses kept on to the model of employer-employee kind of wage labor setups, they would probably be fairer than they are now. Would that be something you could agree with?
Sure, I would say that. And
Yeah.
I kind of want to dive in like the nuances of like the semantic, the idea of like capitalism. So what you're talking about right there is like kind of what I would be opposed to, right? Like one of the definitions of capitalism that goes around, and there's a list done by C4SS. They do a lot of great work. It's this is a definition of capitalism that gets thrown around, and it is widely accepted by a lot of people. It's the rule of workplaces, society, and if there is one, the state, by capitalists. That is, by a relatively small number of people who control investable wealth and the means of production. And so my idea of like, the wage labor scenarios are often, done by large corporations. Think of like, like Sonic, McDonald's, like Walmart. These massive corporations have really wealthy people at the top, and they, have small workers that don't really make very much, right? So in my ideal anarchist society, there would be better alternatives to that, and a lot of the privileges, a lot of the privileges they get on behalf of like small businesses, because the state gives them privileges in the market that keeps small businesses down and keeps them up. That wouldn't exist, and you would be able to have smaller businesses where you might not have to work for a small wage, and you might have a better say over like the conditions you work in, right? And stuff like that. So yeah.
No, I think we mostly agree there. I think the only differences we might have is a little bit in the semantics. I wouldn't agree with that definition of capitalism, but like I said, I don't wish to die on the hill of trying to debate the term.
There are multiple definitions.
Right. I find myself, it's like I have a love-hate relationship with the word. Like I wish there was a better one, but I've yet to come across it, because free market just kind of seems a little bit too vague. Like all anarchists think that they believe in a free market, even communists. So it's like, that's not specific enough. So it's the best word I have at the moment. If anyone ever comes up with a better one, I'd use it. So it sounds like economically speaking, we're probably not too far apart. It sounds like you would be against more of a, I mean, like when I talk to the left, like the far left socialists and communists that are anarchists, I feel like their ideas are, even the ones that aren't tankies, the ones that aren't like advocating for violent ways to get to their perfect, anarcho-communist utopia. I feel like their ideas are just fundamentally flawed and sort of unrealistic. They don't really contend with the way that humans and nature work, whereas it sounds like you're kind of more of this kind of in like that left mutualist camp where even if we have some slight semantical disagreements along the edges, that we're both trying to contend with to advocate for an economic structure that would comport more with reality, and that wouldn't rely on some sort of like we have to use the state to like push this like that's like where I kind of draw my line, like when the left anarchists are like, well, I'm against the state, but I'm against capitalism more, so we have to use the state to destroy capitalism, and then we'll somehow deal with the state later. It's like, well, that seems a little convenient.
Yeah, speaking of tankies, they don't like me very much, and if they hadn't canceled me by now, them seeing me on this show with an ANCAP, I would already be canceled anyways.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I almost feel like mutualists are the true left anarchists, and the tanky ancoms and stuff are just confused.
Well, I would say a lot of actual ANCOMs or like libertarian socialists aren't tankies. The ones that you see that are shilling for the regimes of like China and North Korea, those aren't ANCOMs. They're just Marxist Leninists. They're just tankies. And in a lot of like left libertarian spaces, even libertarian socialist spaces, those people aren't welcome. Like there's a group on my campus that was originally a YDSA chapter, but now they're kind of rebranding themselves. And I go to some of their meetings sometimes just to kind of like, have a good faith discussion. And they hate tankies. They're like, they consider themselves to be a lot of them are ANCOMs, a lot of them are libsocs, and they, they hate tankies. But as to your, we do agree a lot on markets, and I get in trouble with a lot of libsocs because I'm a big fan of markets. I think it's the best way to arrange economically that we have tried. It's the best way to voluntarily associate, and mutually engage in contract with each other. Markets are a good thing, and I think they should be free. So,
yeah, I agree. So moving off the economic, I guess there's two more areas where I want to kind of go over our, sort of like agreements and disagreements, I guess. I guess we should touch on borders a little bit. I saw your shirt, Abolish ICE. Now, I'm a little bit, so the anarcho-capitalist or right anarchist camp is a little bit, it's like divided into two sub-camps because, and I find myself more on the camp of the open borders. And so I actually side with a lot of left anarchists more on this. And there are plenty of right anarchists that are, pretty staunchly for open borders. But I also feel like I have to, at least for the purpose of conversation here, try to steelman and represent my fellow right anarchists who are not so keen on open borders. And so I'm going to put that hat on metaphorically here and sort of try
the worst kind of hat. The worst kind of hat.
But it's like I share their concerns. I just feel like we like basically, to sum it up, is that a lot of the right anarchists who are concerned about borders, it's like I don't think that their points are necessarily invalid, because at the end of the day, it's like I'm not really for open borders. I'm for the abolition of state borders, and I think the only legitimate borders would be those that are constructed by like the borders of your private property. That's the only legitimate border in my anarchist framework. State borders are always illegitimate. I don't really advocate for open borders in the sense of like I don't really advocate for the state. But while the state exists, I'm faced with, okay, well, while the state is enforcing a border, what is the situation I could advocate for that is the least damaging to human life and liberty? And when I look at it from that framework, I feel as though open borders is what's the right word here? Is the least bad option, I guess. I think there are some concerns, though, with open borders that left anarchists tend to, I think, wash away, that I'm sympathetic to. And so maybe we could at least get into that. It's like, and again, it's like, these concerns don't sway me into advocating for closed borders, but they at least make me go, well, it's a complicated equation that I can respectfully agree to disagree with my companions, I guess, and be like, well, I disagree with you, but I can see where you're coming from. I guess like the biggest thing that would come up, and it's not even so like let's eliminate the cliche one, the whole like, well, you can have a welfare state or open borders, but you can't have both, is a silly argument, and I can't even try to pretend to have that stance, because to me it's silly. Actually, it's kind of like it's almost 100% wrong, because the welfare state couldn't survive open borders, and that's almost an argument as to why even the Democrats will never open the borders. What's funny is I used to be a Bernie Sanders supporter. I wasn't always on the right. I did come from the left, so that's kind of why I'm able to sort of see both sides. But I was never Bernie Sanders and other left people. They've never always been super open borders. A lot of them have paid lip service to like we need borders and reasonable restrictions, but we just shouldn't lock people up in cages and stuff like that. But a lot of them, even if they now, like during the Trump years, they were very critical of Trump, but now we've kind of seen a lot of them have had to kind of turn full circle and sort of like be proponents of borders in a sense, because they know, if we actually had open borders, the welfare state would pretty much have to like cease to exist. Like they can't exist at the same time. But that's not an argument against open borders. That's actually more of an argument for open borders. It's like, if you want the welfare state to end, open the borders up, or try to, but you'll probably fail because they won't let you do that. We would probably agree there, I would imagine.
To a large extent, I'm reminded of that Bernie example, the Bernie Sanders example that you gave. I'm reminded of that one interview he had with I think it was MSNBC or something like that, where he was asked about whether he supports open borders, and he goes, "Open borders? No, that's a Koch brothers position."
Right? Yeah.
I very
right.
very,
Yeah.
very cringe Bernie Sanders, obviously.
Right.
But as far as I know what you're talking about. There's a sect of right libertarians or right anarchists who would assert the idea of private borders, whatever, that can mean different things to different people.
Like I said, I would be an advocate for private borders, but it's but we don't have that now. So what do we do?
and so for me, there's two different things that can happen, right? Either every single bit of land in the U.S. or along the U.S. border, right, or both U.S. borders, right, even with Canada, is privately owned, and so therefore each person would need permission from the private person to go cross that person's property, or there would be parts of the border that get left unowned and people can walk across it, right? That last scenario I think is great. Love that scenario, right? But in the scenario where all of the border is privately owned, and like you can't like get into the US without like permission from this guy, right? Like if I'm in Mexico, right, and I want to go see my friend in like Arizona, right, and I have to cross someone else's house to get there, or someone else's property to get there, right? Like I believe in the freedom of movement, just like any good libertarian should, and I don't think that person in the middle has a right to say you can't come here, right? I'm not saying that this person going to Arizona can go into this person's house, right, to get there. I'm not saying he can go like through like a fenced off area to get there, but like let's say this person owns like a wooded area and is not using it at all. Who is he to say, no, you can't go through this open field that I own that I'm not using to go see your friend? If you do, I'll shoot you, right? I don't think that's any good. And I'll end this part with this, because I pulled this from the LP platform from 1978. It's a good quote. It's part of it. We further hold that the owners of property have the full right to control, use, dispose of, or in any manner enjoy their property without interference, until and unless the exercise of their control infringes the valid rights of others. Now, I would argue, as long as other pro-immigration or pro-open borders libertarians would argue, is that like you telling that person you can't cross this open field would be infringing on that person's right to freely travel to his friend in Arizona,
Okay, so I disagree with you, but there's a way I'm going to circle back around to where I will kind of be in agreement with you. So it's kind of like a little bit of both. I don't think that people have an inherent right to travel. I don't think that's not the way I would conceive of what we're getting at. I think that people have a right to not be trapped or but basically it's like you have a right to not have, it always comes down to like you have a right to your body and you have a right to not be aggressed against. It's like I only believe in negative rights. So I'm always careful to like, I don't want to ever accidentally advocate for a positive right. And the idea of me saying that people have a right to the freedom of movement is in a way kind of a slippery slope into a positive right. But what I would say is that people have a right to not be entrapped. You can't tell somebody, stay here, and if you move in any direction, like, I'll kill you. Or like you're not allowed to leave, and you construct barriers around them. And insofar as that's true, someone can use private property for aggression. And this is something that ANCAP sometimes, don't realize, I think, or like they do, but like they forget about it in certain areas. Like you can legitimately own a gun, but if you use that gun to shoot somebody, that's not protected by your private property rights. You've clearly committed aggression against somebody with your private property. I would argue that the same applies for not trapping people. Like you have a right to private property, but if you purposely use your private property to entrap someone to a point where if you tell them, if you take any step in, these different ways, I'm going to shoot you or initiate some kind of aggression against you or extort you, that is a problem. That is actually an initiation of aggression.
Yeah, as long as that person isn't posing a threat to the person that owns the property, right?
Right.
As long as he's not like threatening to like go into their home or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. I guess you could say like if somebody was if we had like an axe murderer in our town and we decided to trap him, that would probably be justified because he was going around hurting people and we're using our private property in defensive aggression, not initiating aggression. But assuming the person's just innocently minding their own business, if we come around and like, we've legitimately acquired all the property around your house, and now if you take one step off your property onto any of ours, we're going to shoot you. Like, you've created a hostage situation in my mind, and that is a violation of somebody's rights. The solution to that isn't that there's a problem with private property. Rather, I think the solution is that the kind of scenario you described where like the border is all privately owned and people can't pass is, in my mind, unrealistic, because the market is worked through incentives, right? There's going to be somebody, probably a lot of somebodies on that long stretch of border who are, even if they're selfish, right? Like I'm not trying to make some kind of like plea to human goodwill. I don't even have to do that. I can just plead to human selfishness. Somebody can go, well, I can just be a selfish a-hole and not let this person cross. Or what if I don't know, like just charge them a small fee, work out a contract with them where we're mutually benefiting, where it's like, you want to come and go from this side to this side? All right, well, let's work out a contract where it's mutually beneficial to the two of us. Somebody might even go, there's probably even going to be some people, though, who would just say, oh, just free travel. Like I created this little walkway where people can just freely come and just stay on the walkway and you're fine. But then like those might be like, okay, well, the free one is 5 miles down the road. And the one that charges me, 0.05 Bitcoin is 2 miles down the road. I'll pay the little bit to not be inconvenienced to travel further. And so this is the way the market would solve the problem. And it's not through an assertion of a positive right to freely travel anywhere without restriction. Rather, like there are restrictions, but they're natural market restrictions. And because they're through the market, they're not going to be unduly restrictive in a way that would violate someone's right to not be entrapped. If that ever happened, you would because you cannot initiate aggression against somebody, there would be, if something happened where it's like you acquired property, but your property has now entrapped somebody, you would have some kind of moral obligation to that person to work out through some kind of contract their ability to leave their property. Because otherwise, you would be holding them hostage in my mind. So it's a little slippery. Some ANCAPs disagree with me on this because they think I'm creating a positive right through a lot of different but with a lot of steps in there. It's like, I don't think I am. I think it's just the basic agreement that all libertarians and anarchists have, that you know, it's wrong to initiate aggression against somebody. And you know, people, like, if people aren't allowed to leave their homes, that's to me aggression. That makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think a lot of what gets missed in this debate between like private borders and open borders is like a lot of people that are going to be crossing the border are not going to be crossing by land. They're just going to fly.
That's
so like, you can't really, you know, you're going to fly. Entering people's private property isn't really that much of an issue there anymore. And
but I own the air. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right. I also think that a lot of the roads will not be privately owned. I think a lot of it will be not publicly owned in the sense that like the state owns it, but like just people use it, and like it's, you know,
well,
it's just like common understanding that like people can like use the roads, like not like it's, you know what I mean?
Maybe I like probably maybe like pre-existing roads in small communities and stuff would just be like, nobody feels a need to regulate it because it's not a big deal. In more urban environments, I feel like most roads would be owned, but some might be free to use. Like I said, some churches or you know, charitable organizations or whatever might have like roads that are sponsored through just like donation, or just to be like, hey, like this road is free to use. Now, those roads might not be always accessible, and they might not always be as well maintained. So like people just have choices, right? It's like, well, do I travel farther for the free road that's bumpy, or do I pay for the toll road that's, you know, closer and it's smoother with, you know, well, better painted lines and things like that. And this is the way I think that the market kind of solves that problem. But the problem we're still dealing with is, what do we do in the here and now while the state exists? And I don't know. It's like, this probably is a good segue into the other disagreement, because I feel like a lot of the issues, like when right anarchists criticize open borders for economic reasons, I think they're wrong. But when they criticize it for the cultural reasons is where I'm a bit more sympathetic. And there's a whole other side to this right versus left we haven't gotten into, which is kind of like cultural. And this is where it gets messy, because there are some people who call themselves right anarchists, but they wouldn't really classify themselves as culturally right leaning. And so that's where it gets a little bit messy. Whereas like I'm kind of like both. I'm like right leaning economically, but I'm also like I would classify or label myself as a conservative Christian. So my religious beliefs lead me to have very conservative views on marriage, sex, gender, and just like the right way to live a happy life, I guess. Now I'm an anarchist, so I don't believe in imposing any of that through legislation, obviously. You know, I'm happy to live next door to a gay couple. Like, it doesn't hurt me. I don't care. It's just not what my
Hoppa would not be happy with you.
No, some of the Hoppians aren't happy with me. I don't care. So some of my best friends are gay, but it's like, I don't agree with their lifestyle from a religious sense, but it's like, but you're not hurting me. To me, I view it the same way as like an atheist. Like, I probably view someone in a gay relationship the way an atheist views my Christianity. It's like, well, I don't agree with you. I don't believe it. I don't believe that's the right way to live, but I don't care. Do what you want. Like, that's kind of like my attitude. It's a live and let live kind of thing. But yeah, that's an area where I get a lot of, I think that's where I get more pushback than anything. Like, there's the economic differences between anarchists, but a lot of times I feel like I get a lot of shit from libertarians and anarchists more for being a social conservative than I do for any of the other things. And you know, there's not obviously going to be a way that we completely reconcile everything. We're always going to have disagreements. I would like there to be just I don't know, like a truce, to be like, you live the way you want to live and I'll live the way I want to live. But I sometimes I get the feeling that some left anarchists feel like that's not possible, or that an anarchist cannot be someone with conservative social views or religious views that I have. So So yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Real quick, I just wanted to finally touch up on like the property thing. There's an
Oh,
essay in
sure.
this book called "A Plea for Public Property" by Roderick Long. It's a really good essay. I think you can look it up online. It's free online. A lot of these essays from this book are able to be found online at C4SS. Um, but yeah, cultural issues are definitely important. I think a lot of it is. I think the cultural issues are kind of the biggest obstacle in obtaining bottom unity, which is what I seek to obtain. Because
Yeah,
we can easily find disagreement on economics, and okay, we'll set that aside. Let's focus on state oppression right now, and then we can hammer out economics later. Right? That's easy to do for at least for me, anyways.
oh yeah,
But
me too. Well, I even
but
believe in a sort of panarchy where I think true anarchy is not going to have one economic organization that stretches from sea to sea. You know what I mean? Different communities and areas will probably organize a little bit differently, and it's okay if it's voluntary. I don't really care.
Exactly. Yeah. And but I do think even going back on immigration, right? I think a lot of people who are, in favor of immigration restrictions, even those who might consider themselves either libertarian leading or even just libertarians, would oppose open borders or would, be in favor of immigration restrictions for like cultural reasons. Like people like Lou Rockwell who would, oppose open borders because he doesn't like demographic change, right? That sort of thing,
Sure,
and I think that that's kind of more hard to kind of find agreement on there because one, don't really care much about demographic change, and two, I'm a big fan of open borders, as I think most good libertarians should be in favor of, or at least less immigration restriction, even if you're not an anarchist. But
sure.
but yeah, cultural issues are definitely where I think we would find disagreements on, and even going back to the hierarchies, right? Left libertarians, left anarchists, even libertarian socialists, anarcho communists, they would view a lot of these cultural issues as unjust hierarchies, and so by extension, they would seek to abolish these as well. So that might be where a lot of our disagreements would come from as well.
Sure. Yeah, the demographic change is a, like so like personally, I don't care. I grew up in all black churches and in Baltimore, so I'm actually kind of used to being a mi. I was actually I grew up feeling almost like a minority. I was a white Jew going to all black churches and stuff in Baltimore. I was a bit of a minority myself, but uh, so I don't really care about demographics, but I understand the right libertarian concern, which is that if you have a state that is not just has open borders, but that is like through various forces like incentivizing different cultures and groups of people from other countries to come in and to come in too quickly, that can be very destabilizing. And it's not a free market thing when that happens. Like it's one thing when people are just freely moving around in an actual free market setting where there's not this outside force acting, but when like the open borders creates a dilemma where it's not natural, it's still the state monopoly over who gets to come and go, and there are incentives acting upon that. There are things even tangentially related but that aren't the border issue, like the war on drugs and our foreign policy, causing a lot of destabilization across the globe, even and a lot of libertarians know a lot about the Middle East, but don't read a lot about how much like the CIA and other American institutions have really interfered in South American countries and stuff, and the war on drugs being the most obvious one in ways that have destabilized these regions. And so and then you have the welfare state and just like the idea of like American exceptionalism, I guess, that a lot of people around the world still believe in. And so people are concerned, well, if you have this open borders and the incentives that are drawing people in, you're creating a destabilizing effect where uh, there is something I think that's important about cultural, um, what's the word? Like, um, I'm feeling it's like an H word, like
Homogeny.
yeah, homogeny. Yeah, that's right. I think there's something important about that. I don't think it that the culture should be based around skin color or anything silly like that, but at the same time, it has to be based on something, and it has to be arrived at naturally. I don't think you can just chaotically throw a bunch of different cultures and people together and expect that there's not going to be negative consequences from that sort of like I think it's like Tom Woods and Hoppe and Lou Rockwell used the term forced integration, which I think is not right. I understand what they're trying to address, but it's not forced, it's artificial. It's not free market. It's like this weird hybrid of maybe a little bit of people doing what they want to do, but there's still a lot of statism mixed in, kind of like corporations. Like on the surface they can seem like they're free market entities because they're businesses, but it's like you peel back the layers and there's a lot of state intervention mixed in with that. So it's kind of a good analogy that like corporations are really not free markets. Open borders, especially like our current open border system, is really not free market either. Now I still side on that, because even viewing those problems, I just view it as, okay, that's a problem, but it's a better problem to deal with than we close the borders, which ends up like we're pointing guns at people, we're locking people in cages. Also, the flip side of that, what if I want to leave? Like that's a big problem too. So for me, it's just a calculation. It's like, okay, well, they both suck, but this one sucks less. But I still think there are problems, and some of that has to do with that cultural analysis that I think some left anarchists don't really contend with. What are your thoughts?
So there was one thing you said in there about like, this cultural change and, even demographic change has to come about naturally, in which I would agree. Like, yeah, it has to come about naturally. I would think like this movement of people, people wanting to move somewhere, that's natural. Like that's people naturally move. Like humans originally were nomads, right? A lot of the indigenous tribes were nomads, so we want to move. That's natural. I think there obviously I disagree with the idea of like state property, right? And so I think that a lot of the a lot of the problems with our immigration system right now is because of the fact that like it's done by the state, and you have to get permission from the state to come across. And then also the state will incentivize certain people to come over, right? It's relatively hard to cross the border illegal or cross the border legally if you either don't have a family member that lives here, like a spouse or like a cousin or whatever, or B, you don't have a lot of money, right? You either have to have one or two of those things or both to be able to even qualify to come here legally. And so I think that is a big issue with the state enforced immigration system, right? Whether you're bringing in large numbers of those people or not. I just think we should let people come here as long as they're peaceful people. They, while the state exists, right, have a relatively quick and easy background check, like Ellis Island, for example. That was a better system than what we have now.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah,
we can even get status to hop on board with that too, right? So if people want to move here and work here and contribute to our society, then like let them, regardless of whether they have a different political opinion than you do or whether they look different than you do.
I agree. And so like this is where I diverge from my right anarchist friends, where it's like, yes, I see your problems, but it's just, to me, it's more consistent to just say, yeah, there's problems, but at the end of the day, it's worse to give the state the power to control who comes and goes than it is to say, let people come and go. And yeah, the incentive structures and the state mixture, because it controls it still at the end of the day, is bad, but we'd have to keep pushing to eliminate that and privatize it as much as we can. And at the end of the day, there's I forget where I was going with that. But at the end of the day, I think the economic benefits of allowing more freedom of movement will trump the maybe like short-term cultural pains. Because I think it is more of a short-term problem. Like, yeah, if you throw a bunch of like new people into an area, that can create from like the resident people a feeling of there's foreigners coming in here and it can cause a little bit of instability, but I don't think it's a permanent problem. That's just a general fear of the unknown and short term problem that can be overcome. Uh, we just have to, try to create a culture that is good at assimilating people and assimilating towards a sort of, I guess, like meta culture that we can all be a part of, even if we have our own disparate subcultures within that. That's my vision, at least. But it's just, I guess it's like I'm always aware that there's going to be people that disagree with my worldview. Like, I mean, like I grew up a Christian, and I've always had to contend with the fact that there's a lot of people who aren't Christian, who don't believe in the same things that I believe in. I don't get that kind of reciprocity very often from the left. I'm not saying never, but not often. And even sometimes when I
what do you mean
do,
by that?
so it's like, if I say I believe that Jesus died on the cross for my sins and that, and then the Holy Spirit has filled me and that I'm a new creation because of that, and that I pray to God and I feel like I receive prayer answers and revelations throughout my life experiences. Somebody who is not a Christian will look at that and go, well, I just don't believe in any of that. But hey, you're not hurting anyone, so go do whatever you want. And I've learned to live with that. When I meet people of different faiths, even I've learned to live with that. Like, oh, you believe in a different religion, or you're an atheist, or you're just agnostic. You don't know what you believe. I've just learned to be respectful that people have different belief systems and different cultural views. I don't often feel that reciprocity back, though, from people on the left, because it's like if I don't share their views on, let's say, the abolition of gender norms, or like I don't feel compelled to celebrate things about our culture pertaining to sex, whether it's polygamy or homosexuality or whatever. It's like, again, like these aren't things I want to legislate, but they're not things that fit into my cultural view, so they're not things I participate in or celebrate. It's just like, I don't know, like I don't feel that reciprocity. It's like I've had it, like there are people out there that get triggered over the celebration of Christmas, and it's like, well, it's religious, and we have to do, like a lot of libertarians do Festivus and stuff. It's like, so like it's like I want to be catering towards different belief systems, but like there needs to be that reciprocation where it's like people are allowed to disagree with different worldviews and ideologies. Of course, now that gets me in trouble too, because there's some left anarchists that just, I think the ones that are just more determined to, I think, like hate me and pick fights with me, who say, well, gender abolition isn't just an ideology, it's part of science. It's like, well, I don't know. That's a whole muddy thing there, and that could almost be a whole podcast. But it's like, to be fair, I try to be respectful. And here's a good example. I use transgendered people, I use their pronouns. I don't do it because I share their beliefs. I do it just out of common courtesy, in the same way that I kind of expect an atheist to, like, if I'm out in public and I'm praying over my food before I eat, I kind of expect the common courtesy that the atheist isn't going to run up to me and go, your God isn't real. You know what I mean? Like, so in the same way, I try to like just live by that rule of like, I'm just not going to be a dick. I'm just going to, like, if somebody's doing something that I don't share their belief in, but they're not hurting anybody, I don't really give it any mind space. But it feels like in libertarian circles, there's a lot of people who have this left cultural preference, and they want to universalize that. They want everybody in our space, both whether it's the just like broadly people who call themselves anarchists, or it's within the LP or whatever. They want that left culture to be the universal culture everybody shares. And I feel like that's a lot of what causes the divides, both just in the philosophical region, but then also the divides we see within like the movement here in our country, so, and society. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think there's a way we can, again, like we're not going to have the same beliefs, but is there a way that we can share the same space and agree to disagree on these cultural issues, and not Like, I don't want to, like, I'm with Spike Cohen on this. I had him on my podcast a couple weeks ago. Like, let's stop fighting these dumb culture wars. Let's just focus on fighting the state. But if we're going to stop fighting the culture wars and fight the state, then that means like there will be some people with cultural views in liberty circles that are counter to yours. And I don't get the feeling that everybody on the left side of the aisle is okay with that.
Sure. I think we're gonna have probably a lot of disagreement on this particular issue. I think that again, there are certain cultural differences that we can, we can just say agree to disagree and move on. But like, I think there are some where like, these are like really, really important issues to like a lot of people, right? Like so for example, like the way you describe like, you would have different like beliefs than the non-binary person or like the gay person, right? Like I think it's more than just a difference of belief. Like these people have like certain identities that are like inherent to them as like individuals that like if you don't like respect that like to them, or like if you don't see them as that, like that would just inherently be disrespectful to them. I mean, I'm sure you could find a way to agree to disagree, like for example, the platform plank in the LP for abortion, right? It's you can be pro-life or pro-choice. It's just as long as you don't want to use the state to enforce it, right? Like you can't support one way or the other, like either state-funded abortion or a restriction on abortion. Either way, that's not libertarian, and I think that would be a good place to go from.
I'm completely
like
on board with that, by the way.
You can either like, I would 100% disagree with you. I will like, if you have that belief where you don't think that a homosexual person is like, living a good lifestyle, or like if you don't think the non-binary person is who they are, like I'm going to obviously disagree with you. But as long as you aren't going to use the state to force them to be a gender they don't identify with, or as long as you aren't going to let the state discriminate against these people, then I think we can find some common ground there. But obviously, like I'm not going to stay quiet. If these culturally right anarchists or libertarians like want to have a reactionary belief, obviously my Twitter is a great example. I'm not going to keep quiet about it. I'm going to say something.
Would you classify my beliefs as inherently reactionary?
Not you specifically. I wouldn't say so.
I mean, because they don't really feel reactionary to me. They just don't really comport to my worldview. And it's like I like to respect all people. And I mean, insofar as I'm being respected by somebody, I try to show mutual respect. Even when people are a jerk to me, I try to rise above it. Jesus told us to turn the other cheek in the Bible. And insofar as I'm capable of being patient and like shaking off when people are rude to me, I try to do so. But there's something about like, I don't think respecting a person as a person and respecting their rights means respecting or like agreeing with their perspective on all things, even on things on identity. I mean, certainly an atheist is going to reject certain things that are, that I would define as paramount to my identity. I mean, like to me, Christianity isn't just like, oh, I go to church on Sundays because I like the songs. Like I'm a Christian because I identify myself as a child of God. I believe that I have a personal relationship with Jesus as my savior, and that I've been, like the Christian theological description of this is that that we are born again in Christ. Like, and that is our identity, that we are brothers and sisters in Christ. So that is part of my identity. And to some extent, if somebody doesn't hold my Christian faith, they are disagreeing with, like, they're saying that part of how I identify myself, at least to them, they don't validate. And I have to live with that. And certainly I would expect or hope that people can disagree with my beliefs without like, okay, we don't need to be rude to each other. We should be courteous. We should, be good neighbors. We should, I have no problem. Like I said, I have no problem living next to a gay couple or working with them. I mean, I work with gay people within the LP, even, and some people might think I'm making it up, but there's gay and trans people within the Mises caucus that I work with. It's like, I don't care. Like, they're still people. I don't view them as less human than anybody else. I just don't share either certain preferences or beliefs with them. And to me, it just seems like that's accepted, that we can agree to disagree with people's beliefs on X, Y, and Z. But then on the left, it's like, but you're not allowed to disagree on A, B, and C. And I don't see the consistency there. So that's where I'm at. And again, it's not out of prejudice. It's not out of being reactionary. It's just, those are my, I mean, I would imagine that in the same way that I feel about my beliefs is probably how a person who believes that they are transgender believes that they're transgender. So like, I can empathetically put myself in their shoes and go, well, yeah, like if that's what they believe, and they believe what they believe in the same way that I strongly believe what I believe, well, like, I'm not going to like be a dick about it. Like, we have different beliefs. In some regard, it's like, isn't that to be expected? Like, are we all like, I don't think we're all going to hold the same beliefs when it comes to things that are a bit more subjective or metaphysical, I guess, like the nature of being and consciousness and meaning. Like, these are things that are more personal and subjective. They're not required in a sense of like, at the very least, like, they're not required to be an anarchist or a libertarian, in my view.
So while I found a definition of reactionary, and hopefully maybe we can hammer this out and maybe find a working one. But this is reactionary refers to a strongly traditionalist political perspective of the person who is opposed to social, political, and economic change. So, like, would you say that you are opposed to, like you have a traditionalist perspective and you oppose social, political, or economic change?
I mean, compared to what? I mean, it's just kind of it to me. It's sort of it's very vague. It's like, compared to what? I mean, probably 150 years ago, I would have been viewed as a radical progressive for being an abolitionist against slavery. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not against change if change is necessary, but it's like, compared to what? Like, not all change is intrinsically good. Not all change is progress. So, I mean, as an anarchist, I kind of consider myself for the advancement of social and political change in a way that I view as positive and beneficial for human society. But I have religious views that cause me to have different beliefs about things that are pertaining to human life and identity than people who don't share my religious sentiments. And so it's like, I don't know if I would really classify them as reactionary in the way that you're using that. Like, to me, a reactionary is somebody who is almost unprincipled, who goes, anytime somebody's trying to change the status quo, I'm against it. It's not what I'm doing. I'm not against changing the status quo. You know what I mean? Like, if there's things about the status quo that are bad, let's change them. But it doesn't mean that I will just it doesn't mean that one has to automatically be the opposite of that and be in favor of every proposed change, right? You know what I mean? So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from. And I think a lot of change wouldn't, just because something is changed doesn't mean it's good. I can kind of agree with you there. I think it's just a matter of like what kind of change, like reactionaries would be against something like, trans people being more accepted, or like, LGBT people in general being more accepted. Like,
I think it just depends what you mean by accepted. I mean,
right. Okay. So right now there is legally a way in which, like, adoption centers in Mississippi can discriminate against people on the basis of their sexuality. Like if a
Okay.
person who is like going to certify an adoption sees the couple as like a gay couple, they can legally say, no, you can't adopt this baby or this child or this young adult
What are they?
because I don't
Are
agree
they?
with your lifestyle.
Are they private entities or are they state entities?
Any entities, it's based on like a religious freedom exemption. So any worker who is working
So
at an adoption center.
I would be against a state law that forced private entities to discriminate against a gay couple or a trans couple or individual. I'm okay with private entities setting their own, like if there's a private adoption agency and we live in an anarchist society, if they want to privately choose that, we're not going to our like every so discrimination is inherently part of any business. Like you're going to set rules and parameters about who you do and don't do business with and what what qualifications you look for in people you hire or work with. And so an adoption agency is inherently discriminatory because they're not just going to hand out, it's not like, hey, form a line, every person gets a kid. They're going to screen people and they're going to have some kind of list of qualifications they're looking for in potential parents. Every place is going to have maybe some things that are hopefully overlapping, like we would you're not a criminal, you're not a rapist, you're not a what I mean, you're able to care for yourself, like things that are common. But then there's going to be some qualifications that will vary between place to place, I would imagine. Some places might say, oh, we want your income to be at this level, and other places might have an income requirement that's lower or higher than other ones. And some, if they're religious or whatever, might have other qualifications. But if it's all voluntary, I don't think it's anti-libertarian or anti-anarchist.
Yeah, in an anarchist society, I would say there's not really much that would like legally, because there wouldn't really be many laws that would like
Right.
stop this adoption agency from like discriminating on the basis of like sexuality. But I would say that like I, along with a lot of other left libertarians, left anarchists, even right libertarians, right anarchists would boycott the shit out of this adoption agency because it's inherently immoral to deny
sure.
someone
I
the
mean,
right to adopt because of the their sexual orientation that you might personally disagree with. So
no,
yeah,
I mean,
you use the market against them.
you can do that. I mean, I would personally think it's a waste of time. I just think it's you can boycott it all you want. I don't think that'll make it go away. But I mean, but you're free to do so. At the end of the day, it's like there are people out there who think that a transgender couple or homosexual couple shouldn't have kids. There are people out there that think that it's wrong for me as a Christian to they would prefer me not to have kids who I raised to be Christian. So that's discriminatory in some sense. People that they like, oh, I hope you don't raise your kids with your beliefs and stuff. It's like, well, again, so we're all going to have cultural preferences and beliefs, and we all think we're right. You know what I mean? It's like there's no objective principle we can judge your cultural views and my cultural views and say which one is right. They're inherently subjective. There's nothing we can appeal to if it's all voluntary and no one's initiating any type of coercion. So to me, it's like, we can either, my hope would be in an anarchist society that the culture wars would die out and that people just, have conversations and, maybe try to persuade people of their point of view. But if they can't, they just agree to disagree and they don't take it personal. Now, I'm not ignorant to the fact that certain minority groups have been historically and even today are discriminated against in certain states in ways that are codified by law. And insofar as I'm an anarchist, I'm against all that. I'm pro-life, but I'm against the Texas ban on abortion. You know what I mean? So it's like anytime we're talking about codifying things into law, I'm going to be firmly on your side. But there's just a difference between, I would hope for the reciprocity of if the state was passing mandates that were keeping me from practicing my religion, I would hope that you would fight for my right to practice my religion. In that same sense, I fight for an LGBT or GSM individual to practice their lifestyle however they want, so long as they're not hurting anybody. I actually view them as more of like the way I psychologically conceptualize it is just that they're almost a different religion. They have their own cultural preferences and views and beliefs about human life and identity. That's not a religion in the same way, but it kind of is an ideology that's close to that. So, I have to fight for their rights to live their lives according to their conscience. If I want the right for me to live my life according to my own conscience. So that's what I hope we can foster. But and I won't say there's nobody on the right who's against that. There's people on the right who want to fight the culture wars too. But it's like, I don't know, like maybe we could at least save that for when we can, like maybe when there's no more bombs being dropped in Yemen and we don't have the world's biggest prison population, and like, all the actual like really evil shit that's going on in the world. Like maybe we could focus on the evil shit going on in the world where people are being killed and tortured and locked up before we get back into debating over, what gender is and, if it's wrong for people to have certain religious beliefs. It just seems like, why would you make that your priority? It doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, I can sort of sympathize with that. I don't know how much time you have left. Are we good? How much longer do you think we can go with this?
We'll try to. I don't know. What's I do have to go here soon, so let's try to. I mean, let's kind of like try to take the next 5 minutes to maybe wrap up this portion of the conversation,
Sure.
and then we'll kind of close out after that.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to really get across throughout this whole episode is that I think that left libertarians and right libertarians should unite on the issues that we agree on. And I think that, I've only been a left libertarian for about 6 months now, or less even, just reading about it and stuff like that, and like the general philosophy, it just makes a lot more sense to me. But I think that a lot of the history of the libertarian movement and the party is has a lot of influence from left libertarian thought. Even some of the platform planks from the original platforms, that was they have a lot more positions that I would say fall more in line with a left libertarian position, left libertarian in the sense of market anarchists, right? Than say a right libertarian perspective.
I would disagree with you there slightly,
and I think that today, the Libertarian Party and the American Libertarian Movement is seen as this right wing thing, where even I see a lot of libertarians online and even in person at these events say you can't be a libertarian and be left wing. You can't be a libertarian and be a socialist even, and that's just objectively not true. And there are platform planks from and I even if you're okay with it, I want to read some of these and see if you maybe agree with them, but you can feel free to respond to what I said before that.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, I don't entirely disagree with you, although I think also the original libertarian platform was pretty explicitly, on the capitalist private property side and not socialist, at least economically speaking. It wasn't for collective ownership of the means of production and whatnot. But
I'd agree
that was my only distinction I wanted to make. But go ahead and read the planks.
Okay, so I'll just read 2 or 3 real quick, and then we can just kind of discuss. There's this one from 1980. It's unions and collective bargaining. We support the right of free persons to voluntarily establish, associate in, or not associate in labor unions. An employer should have the right to recognize or refuse to recognize a union as a collective bargaining agent of some or all of his or her employees. And this is where it really gets into a lot of disagreements we might have. Is we oppose government interference in bargaining, such as compulsory arbitration or imposing an obligation to bargain. Therefore, we urge repeal of the National Labor Relations Act and all state right-to-work laws, which prohibit employers from making voluntary contracts with unions. And we oppose all government back-to-work orders as imposing a form of forced labor. So I feel a lot of where right libertarians would disagree with that is on the right-to-work laws, but that was in the platform in the 1980s. What would you say to that?
What was read the part again about the right to work laws? I thought that you said they were against them.
Yeah, they are. We oppose government government interference in bargaining, such as compulsory arbitration or imposing an obligation to bargain. Therefore,
okay, I see.
we
Okay.
urge the repeal. Yeah.
Sorry, I was confusing the concepts in my head. Um, yeah, no, I maybe some, but I can't imagine any well-read right libertarian disagreeing with that. I mean, right to work laws are just a bad government statist invention to counteract the abuse of the union system. And I agree, the libertarian and the anarchist solution is just, eliminate all of it and just allow voluntary contracts and associations to form. Some places will probably have unions and some places won't, and the market sorts that out beautifully, I think.
Yeah, very based answer. A couple more. I'm gonna try to pick some of like the smaller ones. So there's colonialism. This is from 1978. It states the United States colonialism has left a legacy of property confiscation, economic manipulation, and overextended defense boundaries. We favor immediate independence for all colonial dependencies such as Samoa, Guam, Micronesia, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, both to free these lands from U.S. dominance, and to free the U.S. from massive subsidization of them at taxpayers' expense. Land seized by the U.S. government should be returned to its rightful owners.
So yeah, I mean, end the empire and colonialism. The only caveat is it's not always possible to return property to the rightful owners, and so sometimes we have to live with that. If the rightful owners are still alive, then maybe, but if the rightful owners are dead, it can get kind of messy and impossible to perfectly go back through history and try to figure out exactly what to do with stuff. And as long as if the current owner didn't acquire it violently, but like the prior one did, I tend to think that the property should stay with the current owner and not be confiscated from them, because to me that's kind of like two wrongs don't make a right. But that's the only distinction I would make. I would agree with that on principle.
Okay. And then last one I want to bring up is from 1986. It's about monopolies. We condemn all coercive monopolies, and we recognize that government is the source of monopoly through its grants of legal privilege to special interests in the economy. In order to abolish monopolies, we advocate a strict separation of business and state. And it goes on, we defend the right of individuals to form corporations, cooperatives, and other types of companies based on voluntary association. Laws of incorporation should not include grants of monopoly privilege. In particular, we oppose special limits on the liability of corporations for damages caused in non-contractual transactions. We also oppose state or federal limits on the size of private companies and on the right of companies to merge. We further oppose efforts in the name of social responsibility or any other reason to expand federal chartering of corporations into a pretext for government control of business.
Agreed. And corporations are not free market entities. So yeah, I agree with all
mean,
that.
as they say, we might actually be fellow travelers after all. Then it's crazy.
Yeah, no, I think honestly, if we could get past the cultural stuff, there's really, I think, a lot of agreement on the issues, and even though, I mean, there's probably some extremes on both ends that would have a hard time being reconciled. But I feel like for the most part, I've always tried to find camaraderie with the left libertarians and anarchists, but it feels like the cultural issues, like I think you said, are the hardest to reconcile. I haven't given up hope that they can be. I'm all for the idea of bottom unity in theory, but there has to be mutual respect, I think, on both sides to fight for each other's rights to freely, to hold beliefs about the world that they've come to genuinely, and not be like, neither side should try to implement social or peer pressure or shaming to try to, like, oh, well, you're not a real anarchist if you're X, you know what I mean? It's like, I don't think you have to be a conservative to be an anarchist, you know what I mean? It's like, you can be you can be an SJW for all I care, you know what I mean? It's like, that stuff's unimportant to me if it's unimportant to you. It's kind of what my philosophy is. So but yeah, I think it was a good talk. I think we covered a lot of ground. I will let you give any closing remarks you want to give on the conversation and, the topics we covered before I close this out.
Sure. If you want to learn more about left libertarianism or like the specific form of left libertarianism that I agree with, which is or that I ascribe myself to, which is left-wing market anarchism, you can obviously read this book. You can also find like essays from it online everywhere on C4SS. You can even watch this episode of the Tom Woods Show where he had Gary Chartier on to describe left libertarianism and left-wing market anarchism, which is I think is a it's a great
Are left anarchists allowed to positively talk about Tom Woods?
Actually, no, it's in the code of conduct. You can't, like, it's not allowed. But it was a good episode, and I
remember that episode.
And to that point, I think that Tom Woods could have learned a lot, from that episode himself. I mean, he, basically understood what left libertarianism was in that episode. But like, then he goes on Twitter and calls like Cato left libertarianism, which is like just absolutely not true. Cato's not left. They're they promote capitalism. They promote like these things that like left libertarianism.
I don't think Cato's left. I think it's worse than that. They're like neoliberal libertarians a lot of times, which is like they're libertarians who want to suck up to the regime and the establishment. I would say it's like when you're trying to fit in with the cool kids. That's what I think. I mean, that broadly speaking, there's people at Cato I like, but I wouldn't want to generalize too much there. But yeah, I wouldn't call. Yeah, it's just these terms are very often slippery. You know what I mean? So I agree with you. But yeah, Tom Woods, that was a great. Tom Woods I think he's had multiple left libertarians on to talk about their ideas and stuff. So. And he's had Malice on a lot, and they went over Malice's book where he had a lot of left anarchists and stuff in there. So there's definitely a lot that I think that we can learn from each other. So, but yeah, I interrupted you a little bit. So
I was going to say one more thing. I was just going to say one more thing. If you want to find the most base libertarian content on Twitter, because I am the only real libertarian, you will follow me at RealZachBrit. And yeah, I look forward to more discussions about the nuances between this, and look forward to more promotion of libertarian unity and bottom unity, and attacking the cult of the omnipotent state and all unjust hierarchies. Yeah,
pretty well said. Yeah, and you're a real libertarian if you're calling everybody else not a real libertarian. That is the lingo for sure. Well, thanks, Zach, for coming on. It was a fun conversation. And yeah, we'll do it again sometime. Thanks everybody for watching, and like, share, subscribe if these kind of conversations are the kind of thing you like. If you're watching this and there's a subject that you want to come on the show and talk about, you can reach out to me like Zach did, and we can set something up. I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody, left or right, libertarian or statist. I've had a pretty diverse set of guests on my show, and it's always not always controversial, but there generally is some people who will have something to complain about. But I think for the most part, it's been beneficial to me. I love hearing from a wide array of different people and perspectives. I detest echo chambers. So yeah, pretty much any subject related to politics, liberty, culture, religion, economics, whatever. I'm happy to have a conversation with people who are willing to come on and talk in good faith. So with that said, thanks, Zach, again for coming on. And everybody, until next time, remember, don't fear the fire.